Rome, ad 37. The air inside the capital was thick with celebration, relief, and raw expectation as news raced through the crowded streets. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known by the childhood nickname Caligula, had ascended to the throne. After the long and often paranoid rule of Tiberius, Rome seemed desperate for a new beginning. People poured into the forum, priests offered sacrifices, senators bowed deeply, and soldiers in polished armor spoke in excited tones about the young emperor who had grown up in military camps under the beloved general Germanicus. Few moments in Roman history carried as much hope as that spring morning, but hidden behind the cheers and the divine hymns, behind the glowing rhetoric of a savior emperor, was a truth that only time would reveal. Rome had unknowingly placed power in the hands of one of the most brutal and sadistic rulers it would ever witness. Caligula's rise to power came wrapped in the legacy of his father. Germanicus was adored across the empire, respected by troops, citizens, and political leaders alike. His sudden death in AD 19 shocked Rome and stirred suspicions against Tiberius, who many believed feared Germanicus's growing influence. Caligula, just a child at the time, became the focus of public sympathy. His youth was spent surrounded by the military legions on the Rhine. Soldiers doted on him, sewing miniature boots similar to theirs, earning him the nickname Caligula, meaning little boots. It was an affectionate name meant to connect him to his father's glory, but in the years to come it would symbolize something far darker, something grotesque and unforgettable. When Tiberius died in March AD 37, the transition of power was swift. The Senate and the Roman people embraced Caligula with a kind of zeal that bordered on desperation. They projected onto him every hope they had repressed during the grim, fear-filled regime of Tiberius. The first few months of Caligula's rule reflected this optimism. He granted bonuses to the soldiers, released those unjustly imprisoned, abolished treason trials, and even honored the memory of his late mother, Agrippina the Elder. Rome erupted in gratitude. Ancient writers describe festivals, feasts, and days of public joy. The city was convinced a golden age had begun, but this hope would not last. In October AD 37, only months after his rise, Caligula suffered a sudden and violent illness. Most historians describe it as either a severe fever, possible encephalitis, or a neurological condition. When he emerged from it, his personality had shifted dramatically. Whatever restraint, empathy, or political discipline he once had seemed to melt away. What rose in its place was a figure consumed by paranoia, indulgence, cruelty, and a twisted fascination with suffering. It was during this period that the world glimpsed the first signs of the sadism that defined his reign. One of the earliest displays of his brutality came in the form of executions carried out with theatrical flair. Caligula did not merely punish those he disliked. He staged their suffering. According to the historian Suetonius, he delighted in turning executions into public spectacles, and often ordered them during meals or banquets, so he could enjoy food and death simultaneously. He believed watching a man beg for mercy sharpened the taste of wine and heightened the pleasure of dining. Guests were horrified, but few dared protest. For Caligula, human life became a prop, an entertainment, something to manipulate at will. Then came his notorious cruelty toward the Senate. Tiberius had already strained the relationship between emperor and senators, but Caligula transformed tension into humiliation. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot in the blazing Roman sun, mocking their exhaustion. On other occasions, he invited them to banquets only to laugh openly at their dress, mannerisms, and trembling fear. Caligula sought not just obedience but degradation. He wanted Rome's political elite to feel small, powerless, and constantly on edge. His sadism extended even to the judicial system. Caligula reportedly told one executioner to slowly torture a prisoner so the man would remain conscious long enough to experience every cut. He once declared that he wished all of Rome had a single neck, so he could sever it with one blow. Whether a literal threat or a theatrical exaggeration, it revealed his warped delight in absolute power. The emperor who had been welcomed as Rome's great hope had become the embodiment of terror within a single year. But the seeds of Caligula's cruelty were planted long before he became emperor. His childhood had been shaped by political turmoil, loss, and fear. After Germanicus's death, his mother and 2 brothers were accused of treason against Tiberius, and either starved or tortured to death. Caligula, still young, was forced to live under the emperor's watch on Capri, surrounded by conspiracies, executions, and depravity. The island was a place of shadows, where Tiberius indulged in excess and paranoia. Caligula survived by presenting himself as harmless, obedient, and invisible. The experience shaped him deeply. When power finally came into his hands, he wielded it with the fury of a man who had internalized years of trauma and turned them outward. By AD 38, Caligula's reign had taken a darker, more unpredictable turn. He openly mocked the gods, declaring himself a living deity. Temples were adorned with statues bearing his face. Roman citizens, senators, and soldiers were ordered to worship him as a divine figure. This was not mere vanity. It was another layer of his sadism. By forcing Rome to kneel before him, he found a way to exert ultimate control over their minds, not just their bodies. Resistance meant death. Obedience meant humiliation. The emperor wanted both. It was also around this time that Caligula's cruelty turned personal. He targeted individuals he felt had slighted him, even unintentionally. A nobleman who admired his wife too openly lost not only his freedom, but his entire estate. A wealthy equestrian who hosted a banquet without inviting the emperor found himself ruined. Caligula enjoyed breaking people's lives as casually as one might break a piece of pottery. To him, destruction was an art, and Rome was his canvas. Yet the most disturbing element of his sadism was his unpredictable nature. Citizens did not know what might provoke him. A joke he found amusing one day could result in execution the next. A gesture he praised at noon could anger him by nightfall. Rome existed in a state of constant tension. Even the Praetorian Guard, tasked with protecting him, never fully understood his thoughts or moods. Caligula created an atmosphere where fear became the foundation of loyalty. People followed him because they were terrified not to. As AD 39 approached, Rome was beginning to understand the reality of the man they had raised to divine status. The emperor who once brought hope now ruled through terror. Executions became more frequent, punishments more creative, and public spectacles more disturbing. The Senate grew resentful, but remained silent. Citizens whispered in private, but cheered in public. Anyone caught expressing doubt risked their life. Caligula had become a storm hovering over the empire, unpredictable and merciless. This was only the beginning of his descent. The most sadistic acts of his reign, the ones that would echo through history, had not yet occurred. Those would come in the years ahead, when his cruelty turned into obsession, when his madness became impossible to ignore, and when Rome realized that a man they once adored had become one of the most feared tyrants in the ancient world. By AD 39, the transformation of Caligula was complete. Rome no longer saw the young, hopeful emperor who had once been praised as the dawn of a new age. Instead, the city trembled under a ruler who reveled in torment, humiliation, and absolute control. It was in this year that Caligula's sadism evolved from unpredictable cruelty into deliberate, calculated terror. The emperor now demonstrated not only a desire to punish, but a fascination with pushing the limits of human suffering, power, and fear. And yet, amidst this horror, Rome was forced to maintain the illusion of loyalty, cheering publicly while quivering privately. This contrast between public obedience and private terror became the essence of Caligula's reign. One of the most notorious examples of his cruelty was his obsession with wealth and the destruction of the rich. He believed Rome's elite were too comfortable, too smug, too reliant on the privileges of their class. To Caligula, this made them perfect targets. He summoned wealthy citizens to his palace, encouraged them to boast about their property, and then confiscated everything they owned under fabricated charges. When one nobleman begged for mercy and reminded the emperor that he had once been a friend to Germanicus, Caligula smiled coldly and said that only made the punishment more enjoyable. The man's estate was seized, his family was ruined, and he was left destitute overnight. For Caligula, suffering was entertainment, misery was sport, but even this paled compared to what he did to those who resisted him. According to ancient sources, Caligula would accuse individuals of treason simply to enjoy watching them panic. When one senator defended himself eloquently before an imperial tribunal, Caligula reportedly sighed with disappointment and ordered the man executed anyway, lamenting that he had been too clever to hate properly. He seemed to feed on the emotional collapse of his subjects, savoring the moment they realized resistance was futile. To Caligula, the ideal punishment was one that destroyed not only the body but the spirit. His cruelty reached new heights in the amphitheatre. Although his predecessors had used gladiatorial games to entertain and satisfy the public, Caligula twisted these spectacles into brutal displays of his power. When the arena ran out of criminals and condemned fighters, he ordered random citizens seized from the crowd and thrown to the beasts. The screams of the innocent did not disturb him. In fact, they delighted him. He believed that fear was the purest form of control, and the arena gave him the perfect stage to display that control before thousands of horrified faces. The emperor also took pleasure in inventing punishments that defied tradition. In one instance, after discovering that the Roman treasury was running low due to his enormous spending on banquets, palaces, and indulgent festivals, he devised a gruesome plan. He ordered wealthy men to lend money to the state at impossible interest rates. Those who refused were executed. Those who agreed often found themselves executed anyway, their fortunes absorbed into the imperial account. To Caligula, this was efficiency. To Rome, it was extortion mixed with bloodshed. His cruelty did not spare his own family. Caligula's three sisters, Agrippina the younger, Drusilla, and Livilla, had grown up with him and endured the same tragedies. But power warped Caligula's perception of family. After Drusilla, whom he loved above all others, died in AD 38, he spiraled into deeper emotional instability. Some historians suggest he deified her out of grief. Others argue that her death removed the one person capable of calming his volatile nature. Whatever the truth, after Drusilla's passing, Caligula became even more dangerous. He exiled Agrippina and Livilla on charges of conspiracy, though the evidence was likely fabricated. Their only crime was existing near someone who viewed relationships not as bonds but as tools or threats. One of the most shocking episodes of his rule occurred when he turned his attention to the infrastructure of Rome. He launched massive building projects, not to improve the city, but to demonstrate his power over nature and reason. The most infamous of these was the floating bridge across the Bay of Baiae, a structure composed of hundreds of ships lashed together. Caligula ordered it built solely so he could ride across it on horseback while wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate. The stunt exhausted Rome's resources, endangered sailors, and served no practical purpose. It was a display of ego and dominance, a reminder that he could command the impossible simply because he willed it. Yet the cruelty that defined Caligula went beyond physical harm. His psychological torment was perhaps even more chilling. Those who served in his palace lived under constant surveillance and suspicion. He would ask servants questions designed to trap them, then punish them regardless of how they answered. When a praetorian officer admitted that he was nervous in the emperor's presence, Caligula mocked him. When another officer claimed he was not afraid, Caligula accused him of complacency and ordered him flogged. There was no safe answer. Every interaction was a test designed to break down the human mind. Caligula's relationship with the military further exposed his instability. At first, soldiers adored him as the son of Germanicus, but soon they saw the darker side of his leadership. In Ad 39, while campaigning in Gaul, Caligula prepared his forces as if for a grand military conquest. The legions waited for orders, expecting to march into Germania or Britannia. Instead, Caligula ordered them to collect seashells from the shoreline. He declared the shells the spoils of war won from Neptune, god of the sea. Soldiers obeyed, but their humiliation spread rapidly through the ranks. This act damaged not only Caligula's reputation, but Rome's military credibility. His cruelty extended into the spiritual realm as well. When a priest hesitated to perform a sacrifice on a day the omens were unfavorable, Caligula taunted him publicly, accusing him of cowardice. In another instance, he ordered a statue of Jupiter brought to his palace so he could speak to the god privately, only to replace the statue's head with his own likeness. Caligula was no longer content to be emperor. He wanted to be worshipped as a living deity, and anyone who questioned this divine status risked death. Despite all this, Rome remained outwardly obedient. Citizens attended the games, laughed at his forced jokes, and praised his decrees. They had no choice. Resistance meant ruin, and even silence could be interpreted as defiance. Senators devised strategies to avoid his wrath, such as pretending enthusiasm, avoiding eye contact, and memorizing his unpredictable moods. Fear became a constant presence, lingering in homes, marketplaces, and temples alike. Caligula had transformed Rome from a powerful republic to turn empire into a stage for his sadistic theatre. As AD 40 approached, Caligula's cruelty escalated even further, especially in the realm of personal humiliation. He grew increasingly fascinated by the idea of destroying the dignity of Rome's most respected figures. When one senator hesitated during a performance, Caligula forced him to attend. The emperor ordered guards to beat him until he could no longer speak. On another occasion, he invited several noble families to a banquet and replaced their wine with vinegar, laughing as they struggled to maintain composure. These acts may seem petty compared to his larger atrocities, but to Caligula, humiliation was a form of domination as powerful as bloodshed. Yet even as he lost grip on reason, Caligula remained aware of one truth: fear protected him. The more ruthless he became, the more insulated he felt from threats. But beneath this illusion, cracks were forming. Enemies were quietly gathering. Resentment in the Senate deepened. The Praetorian Guard whispered behind closed doors. Citizens prayed not for his long life, but for his fall. Caligula believed himself invincible, but the empire was slowly turning against him. The most disturbing acts of his reign were still to come. What he would do in AD 40 and AD 41 would scar Rome forever, pushing the boundaries of cruelty beyond anything the ancient world had seen before. Caligula's thirst for control, suffering, and dominance had no limits, and soon the consequences would erupt in a way he never expected. By the beginning of AD 40, Caligula's sadism had taken on an almost ritualistic quality. His cruelty was no longer the occasional outburst of an unstable ruler, but a daily performance, meticulously crafted to break the will of Rome. What made this stage of his reign so disturbing was not simply the violence itself, but the creativity behind it. Caligula seemed obsessed with discovering new ways to test the limits of human fear, dignity, and loyalty. The emperor who once inspired hope had become a man who thrived on suffering, and Rome had no choice but to watch. One of the most chilling features of AD 40 was Caligula's intensifying persecution of the Senate. He no longer saw senators as political advisors or even potential enemies. He viewed them as toys, props in a cruel game that existed solely to feed his ego. Caligula's contempt for the Senate had deep roots. He knew many senators resented his rise and had remained loyal to Tiberius or Sejanus. Rather than suppressing this resentment through political strategy, he chose humiliation. He summoned aging senators to his palace in the middle of the night, forcing them to run alongside his carriage while he mocked their weakness. If any stumbled, he laughed and ordered them whipped. Yet humiliation alone no longer satisfied him. He wanted to turn the Senate into a parody of itself. One day, Caligula arrived at a Senate meeting dressed in a gold-embroidered cape, announcing that he was appointing his favorite horse, Incitatus, to the office of consul. Ancient writers sometimes exaggerated tales about Caligula, but the story of Incitatus reflects a deeper truth. The emperor wanted to demonstrate that the Senate's authority had become meaningless. By threatening to elevate a horse to Rome's highest political office, he showed that power did not lie in wisdom or tradition, but in his own unpredictable whims. Caligula's relationship with the people of Rome also shifted dramatically. Early in his rule, he had been adored, but now he found pleasure in reminding the masses of their helplessness. During public games, he would order the curtains lowered halfway through popular performances simply to watch the crowd groan. He demanded applause at inappropriate moments, sometimes threatening death to those who clapped too quietly or too slowly. He even shut down the grain supply on several occasions to watch hunger spread through the city, a decision that struck at the heart of Roman stability. When people complained, Caligula mocked them, claiming hunger purified their loyalty. Yet even as he terrorized his own people, Caligula sought to project power across the empire. This desire led to one of the most infamous episodes of his reign, the supposed invasion of Britain. Caligula deployed legions across northern Gaul, creating the impression that he was preparing a major military conquest. Soldiers marched, supplies were stockpiled, and Roman engineers surveyed the coastline. The world watched, expecting Rome's first major expansion into the mysterious island across the Channel. But when the moment came to board ships and invade, Caligula changed his mind. Instead of launching the expedition, he commanded his legions to gather seashells from the shore, declaring them the spoils of war won from Neptune. Whether this incident occurred exactly as ancient sources describe is debated by historians. However, its symbolic significance cannot be ignored. The emperor had humiliated the Roman army, turning its proud legions into a joke. Soldiers were left confused, angry, and deeply embarrassed. Caligula, meanwhile, celebrated the episode as a triumph, marching back to Rome with painted banners proclaiming victory. He believed he had proven that even the sea itself bowed to his will. Caligula also became increasingly consumed by the idea of divinity. He insisted on being worshipped not merely as emperor, but as a living god. He built temples dedicated to himself, demanded sacrifices, and placed his statue in Jerusalem's holy temple, sparking outrage among the Jewish population. What made this act particularly cruel was Caligula's awareness of the sanctity of the temple. To him, desecration was not an accident but a deliberate challenge. He wanted to assert that no god, belief system, or cultural tradition could stand higher than him. His obsession with divinity also manifested in private rituals. He would wander the palace at night dressed as Apollo, Mercury, or Jupiter, forcing servants to kneel and address him as the chosen form of the evening. When one priest hesitated to acknowledge him as Jupiter, Caligula accused him of treason and had him executed. His delusion of godhood was no longer symbolic. It had become a political weapon, but as Caligula's cruelty intensified, so did the danger to those closest to him. His marriage to Milonia, Caesonia, revealed this darker side. Caesonia was older than Caligula, known for her beauty and confidence. Some sources suggest she was one of the few individuals Caligula trusted, yet even she experienced the instability of his moods. Caligula famously paraded her before friends and officials, sometimes in private settings, and sometimes in shockingly inappropriate ways. He seemed fascinated by using her as proof of his dominance over both desire and power. Though he often spoke of her with affection, he weaponized her presence to intimidate those who dared challenge him. Caligula's cruelty toward families was particularly heartbreaking. He frequently targeted entire households, not just individuals. If he condemned a man to death, he sometimes forced the man's family members to watch the execution. In rare cases, he ordered children to be executed alongside their parents, so the family line would be eradicated completely. His reasoning was simple and chilling. He feared that children of his enemies would grow up seeking vengeance. His solution was to eliminate them preemptively. One telling example involved a father who begged for mercy for his young son after being sentenced. Caligula responded coldly that Roman law prohibited executing virgins. The father breathed a sigh of relief, only for Caligula to order the child assaulted before execution, so the law would no longer apply. This story, whether embellished or not, reflects the level of brutality Caligula had begun to normalize. The emperor no longer viewed people as citizens or subjects. They were objects in a cruel experiment. Meanwhile, the empire's finances were collapsing. Caligula had spent enormous sums on palaces, games, festivals, ships, and absurd engineering projects. In desperation, he revived and expanded treason trials to seize wealth. He sold off gladiators, confiscated estates, and auctioned furniture from the imperial palace. Rome watched in horror as its emperor turned fiscal crisis into yet another excuse for cruelty. As the months passed, Caligula grew increasingly paranoid. He believed conspiracies surrounded him. He saw betrayal in every whisper, threat in every glance. He began rotating his personal guard constantly, fearing loyalty might shift. Even the Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect him, felt his unpredictable wrath. Officers who failed to anticipate his moods were flogged. One commander, Cassius Dio, became a particular target. Caligula mocked Dio relentlessly, calling him weak and effeminate, assigning him humiliating orders during public ceremonies. Dio would not forget these insults. Yet Caligula did not realize that his cruelty had begun to unify those he feared most. Senators, equestrians, military officers, and even palace servants saw that the emperor's madness had no limit. Their lives could be destroyed for a joke, a mood, or a passing whim. The atmosphere in Rome was shifting. Conversations that had once died in fearful silence now sparked whispers of rebellion, but Caligula remained blind to the growing danger. He was too consumed by his fantasies, too enthralled by his own power. He believed he was untouchable. He believed Rome was his stage and its people his instruments. He believed fear alone guaranteed his survival. He was wrong. By the end of AD 40, the empire was a pressure chamber. The Senate was broken in spirit, the military humiliated, the people exhausted, the palace filled with dread, and within the shadows of Rome, a conspiracy was forming. A conspiracy born not out of ambition but out of desperation. Caligula's most sadistic acts had brought the empire to a breaking point. The next year would determine whether Rome could survive him. By the beginning of AD 41, Rome had become a city suspended between terror and anticipation. Every citizen, from the humblest craftsman to the highest senator, sensed that the empire could not endure Caligula's rule much longer. His sadism had reached heights that even Rome, a society familiar with cruelty, found unbearable. The emperor's appetite for humiliation, violence, and domination had grown so extreme that life in the capital became a careful performance. People whispered cautiously, servants walked silently, and even soldiers avoided meeting one another's eyes. Rome held its breath, and at the center of it all was Caligula, convinced of his immortality, unaware that his cruelty had set in motion the forces that would soon destroy him. One of Caligula's most chilling acts occurred in the early weeks of AD 41, when he ordered an unprecedented series of executions. He targeted members of prominent families, accusing them of imaginary conspiracies. The trials were nothing more than theatre. Evidence did not matter. Testimonies were irrelevant. Caligula simply wanted to watch how far terror could push Rome. One man was accused of plotting against the emperor because he looked too nervous at a public ceremony. Another was sentenced because his wealth made him an appealing victim. Even minor officials were dragged into the chaos, their families torn apart overnight. Caligula's brutality had become a cycle with no clear beginning or end, and Rome understood that anyone could be next. Caligula's sadism was not confined to punishments. It seeped into the empire's daily life. One infamous story recounts how he covered roads with fine sand so his horse, incitatus, would not be disturbed by noise. Meanwhile, citizens struggled to afford basic necessities because the emperor diverted resources to bizarre projects. Caligula erected golden statues, built intricate fountains, and demanded extravagant feasts, even as Rome's treasury collapsed. When the city murmured in dissatisfaction, he responded not with reform, but with more cruelty. He told citizens he would tax marriages, lawsuits, food, and even prostitution. Every aspect of Roman life became an opportunity for Caligula to tighten his grip. In the palace, paranoia reigned. Caligula's behavior had become erratic, even by his own standards. He wandered the halls late at night with guards at his side, muttering about assassination plots. He questioned servants about their loyalty, sometimes killing those who hesitated even slightly. His cruelty developed a new dimension. He began to mock the very people he relied on for his safety. Soldiers of the Praetorian Guard were insulted publicly. Officers were humiliated. Among these individuals was Cassius Dio, the officer Caligula taunted for months. Caligula often called him weak and mocked his voice during military drills. He went so far as to assign Caria humiliating passwords for security posts, such as references to sensuality or submission. Each insult deepened Caria's anger, planting a seed of revenge. Caligula's cruelty extended to foreign relations as well. His insistence on divine honors angered provincial subjects across the empire. The attempt to place his statue in the Jerusalem temple nearly sparked a large-scale rebellion. The region of Judea teetered on the brink of unrest, saved only by the diplomatic efforts of Governor Petronius, who stalled long enough for news of Caligula's death to stop the plan. Scholars today consider this incident one of the most dangerously reckless decisions of his reign, one that could have drawn Rome into prolonged conflict with the Jewish population. Caligula's domestic policies grew equally destructive. He continued to drain the treasury, bankrupting families through sudden taxes and seizures. He expanded luxurious palaces, demanded exotic animals for banquets, and forced Rome's finest performers to entertain him for hours. To replenish funds, he opened a palace brothel staffed by aristocratic women and wealthy wives taken as hostages. He forced senators to attend its opening, mocking their discomfort. Caligula's cruelty had become layered, refined. He no longer needed to spill blood to break a person. A ruined reputation, a stolen fortune, or a public humiliation could be just as devastating. As winter faded into early spring, Rome began to crack under the weight of constant fear. Senators communicated in coded gestures, officers exchanged subtle glances, even the Praetorian Guard whispered of despair. The empire had reached a point where Caligula's death seemed not only inevitable, but necessary. Yet no one dared speak openly. Caligula's spies were everywhere, and his vengeance was swift. The breaking point came in late January AD 41, when Caligula announced plans for yet another series of executions. Several senators were on the list. So were a handful of military officers and influential equestrians. Among them was someone close to Cassius Dio. Whether a friend, a relative, or a colleague is lost to history, but the threat was enough to move Dio from quiet resentment to active plotting. He began meeting with trusted allies within the Praetorian Guard and Senate. They discussed possibilities, weighed risks, and considered timing. For days, maybe weeks, the conspiracy grew in the shadows of Rome's most powerful institutions, nurtured by fear and desperation. Caligula remained completely unaware. He was consumed by the preparations for a grand public spectacle. On January 24, Ad 41, he planned to attend the Palatine Games, a religious and athletic festival filled with music, recitations, and theatrical performances. The emperor looked forward to the event, unaware that nearly everyone in attendance whispered about his tyranny. That morning, he rose unusually cheerful. He spoke to his wife, Caesonia, laughed with entertainers, and barked orders at servants. It was a day like any other in his court, filled with arrogance and indulgence. The moment came shortly after midday. Caligula, accompanied by a small entourage, left the performance hall and walked down a narrow passageway beneath the palace. It was here, in this dimly lit corridor, that Cassius Dio stepped forward. The conspirators surrounded Caligula. For the first time, the emperor who had terrorized Rome found himself trapped. Dio struck first, stabbing Caligula. Others followed. Ancient sources disagree on how many blows were delivered. Some say 30, others suggest even more. What remains consistent is that Caligula died violently, bewildered and powerless. His death sent shockwaves through Rome. Citizens celebrated quietly at first, unsure if the news was real. Senators rejoiced openly once confirmation arrived. The Praetorian Guard scrambled to maintain order. Caligula's wife, Caesonia, was killed soon after, and his infant daughter was reportedly murdered as well. A tragic reminder of how violence often breeds more violence. Within hours, the Senate declared Caligula's memory cursed and worked quickly to restore a sense of normalcy. The empire had survived its most sadistic ruler, but not without scars. In the aftermath, Rome reflected on the meaning of Caligula's reign. Historians like Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Josephus preserved the tales of his cruelty. Some stories may have been exaggerated. Others may have been shaped by political bias. Yet even when filtered through centuries of interpretation, one truth remains undeniable. Caligula embodied the dangers of absolute power combined with psychological instability. His rule became a symbol of how quickly hope can turn to horror when authority has no limits. The consequences of his reign reverberated throughout the empire. The Senate became more cautious, the Praetorian Guard more emboldened, and future emperors more aware of the delicate balance between power and restraint. Caligula's life stands as one of history's most disturbing reminders that leadership without accountability can turn a man into a monster and an empire into his playground. Caligula's reign lasted less than 4 years, yet the impact of his cruelty endures nearly 2,000 years later. His name remains synonymous with madness, sadism, and tyranny. Rome survived him, but it never forgot him.